spent 3 years digging through ruins in Romania, only to realize the most terrifying discovery of my life was waiting in a basement halfway around the world, and what I unleashed is still hunting everyone I've ever loved. The fluorescent lights in the Montreal University library basement hummed with that electric persistence that made my teeth ache. February 2024, and I was 4 months deep into cataloging donations from a deceased collector's estate. Victor Ashford, 93 when he died, had apparently spent 6 decades hoarding every obscure manuscript he could find. Most of it was junk, fake grimoires, tourist trap ancient texts printed in the 1970s, that sort of thing. But I was being paid to sort through it all, and as a field archaeologist between dig seasons, I needed the money. I remember the exact moment I found it, because I'd just burned my tongue on terrible vending machine coffee. The pain was sharp enough that I actually swore out loud, and the book fell from where it had been wedged behind a box of Moldavian church records. It hit the floor with a sound that seemed too heavy for something so small. The binding was human skin. I know that sounds dramatic, but I'd handled enough artifacts to recognize it instantly. Pale yellowish, with pores still visible under the deterioration. The pages inside were vellum, probably goat, covered in script that made my eyes hurt to focus on. Not quite Latin, not quite Aramaic. Something older, something that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I should have logged it properly, should have photographed it, filled out the acquisition forms, handed it over to the manuscripts department. Instead, I slipped it into my bag. I told myself I'd bring it back after I'd examined it more carefully. That was the first lie I told myself. There would be many more. My apartment in Côte des Nègres smelled like radiator heat and the Thai food I'd forgotten to throw out 3 days earlier. I cleared space on my kitchen table, pushing aside student papers I was supposed to grade, and opened the book under my desk lamp. The pages crackled, releasing a smell like burned hair and copper. The script resolved itself as I stared, individual letters beginning to make sense in a way that felt less like translation and more like remembering something I'd always known. It wasn't a spell book, it was an instruction manual, a warning, a prison ledger. The text described something called a vessel, a container for what the author called the Hollow King. Not a genie, not a djinn granting wishes. Something that wore the shape of generosity like a predator wears camouflage. Something that had been bound by 7 scholars in 1347, just as the Black Death was spreading across Europe. They trapped it in a vessel of black glass, sealed it with words that cost them their sanity to speak, and hidden it where they prayed it would never be found. The book contained a map, not a modern map, but I could extrapolate. The landmarks were described in terms of 3 days' ride from the monastery of Senla, Benedict, and where the river splits like a serpent's tongue. I sat at that table until 4 a.m., cross-referencing medieval travel records, comparing geographical descriptions, narrowing down the location. By the time dawn turned my kitchen windows gray, I'd identified a site in rural Serbia, an abandoned village called Griankari, destroyed during the Ottoman invasions and never rebuilt. I called Marcus the next morning, Dr. Marcus Webb, my former dissertation advisor, the man who guided me through my doctorate and every major research decision since. He was 71, sharp as broken glass, and possessed of a curiosity that had gotten us both into trouble more than once during fieldwork in Egypt and Turkey. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long pause on the line. Then don't touch it again until I get there. He arrived at my apartment 6 hours later, having driven straight from his home in Burlington, Vermont. Marcus had aged since I'd last seen him. His hand shook slightly as he turned the pages, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of pain he wasn't discussing. He read in silence for 20 minutes while I made proper coffee and tried not to pace. "This is Islamic Aramaic," he finally said, his voice hoarse, with loan words from something pre-Sumerian. Whoever wrote this was trying to describe something they didn't have language for. They're approximating, grasping. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Fear, yes, but also a kind of desperate hope. Catherine, I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. They gave me 6 months 3 months ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. I noticed he looked thin, tired, but I attributed the age. Never this. Marcus, let me finish. He tapped the book with one yellowed fingernail. This text describes the vessel as granting what it calls perfect reciprocity. Not wishes, not magic. It claims to be able to balance any equation, correct any injustice, restore what was lost, but the authors warn that it thinks in scales we can't comprehend, that it considers all things equal in ways that would break human minds. They bound it not because it was evil, but because it was too perfectly neutral, too honest, too exact in its interpretations. You think it's real. It wasn't a question. I think I'm dying, and I think 7 medieval scholars didn't go to this much trouble for a folk tale. I think we need to find out. He closed the book carefully, and I think if there's even a chance this could give me more time, I have to take it. I wanted to argue, wanted to point out how insane this was, how we were trained scientists who dealt in evidence and peer review, not ancient curses and magical vessels. But I looked at Marcus, at the way his shirt hung loose on a frame that had once been robust, the yellow tinge to his skin that spoke of a liver struggling to function, and I couldn't find the words to refuse him. We left for Serbia 3 weeks later. It took that long to arrange academic leave, book flights, gather equipment, and translate enough of the text to give us confidence in the location. Marcus grew visibly weaker during that time. He started using a cane. His appetite vanished. I caught him vomiting in my bathroom twice, and each time he emerged pale and shaking, insisting he was fine, insisting we were still going. I brought in Yuki Tanaka, a graduate student I'd worked with on a dig in Crete the previous summer, 26, brilliant, with a specialty in medieval European history and a tendency towards skepticism that I thought would keep us grounded. I didn't tell her about the vessel. I told her we were investigating reports of a medieval cache, possibly containing illuminated manuscripts, academic glory, publication potential, the kind of discovery that makes careers. She signed on immediately. The 3 of us flew into Belgrade on a Tuesday in early March. The city was gray under low clouds, streets wet with recent rain. We rented a Land Rover and drove east into the countryside, leaving behind the urban sprawl for rolling hills that still bore the scars of conflicts, both ancient and modern. Carnegie sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud under our tires. Nothing remained of the village except foundations, stone rectangles marking where homes had stood 5 centuries ago, now overgrown with thorny bushes and tough grass. Yuki immediately began documenting the site with her camera, making notes about the settlement pattern, identifying what had likely been the main square. Marcus consulted the book, comparing landmarks, pacing out distances that the text described in terms of arrow flights and stone throws. There, he said finally, pointing to a slight depression in the earth near what we'd identified as the remains of a church. Under there, the text says they buried it beneath the altar stone of the holy place, wrapped in mud, sealed with prayers. They thought consecrated ground would hold it. We spent 2 days excavating. The ground was rocky, difficult, and I was acutely aware that we were conducting an unauthorized dig on what was technically a protected historical site. But the area was remote enough that we saw no one, and I'd grown skilled at justifying things to myself. We're not disturbing anything significant. We're not removing artifacts for profit. We're just looking, just checking. The lead container was exactly where Marcus said it would be. 3 feet down, wrapped in rotted cloth that had once been red. The lead had oxidized to a crusty white, but the seal was still intact, marked with symbols that matched the ones in the book. My hands were shaking as I brushed away the last of the soil. Yuki knelt beside me, her skepticism visibly crumbling. "This is real," she whispered. "This is actually real. We extracted it carefully, treated it like the archaeological treasure it was, photographed it in situ, documented everything, then lifted it free and carried it to our tent. It was surprisingly light, no more than a few kilograms, and something liquid sloshed inside when we moved it. Marcus wanted to open it immediately, but I insisted we wait until we were somewhere secure, somewhere private. The image of us cracking this open in a tent in the Serbian wilderness with no backup and no safety measures finally penetrated even his desperation. We drove back to Belgrade that night, checking into a hotel near the airport. A cheap place, the kind of international chain where the rooms were identical and anonymous. I had carried the container wrapped in my jacket, cradling it against my chest, and some part of me recognized how completely we'd abandoned any pretense of scientific method. We were treasure hunters now, grave robbers, really. People who'd read about something impossible and convinced ourselves it was worth pursuing. The hotel room was beige and corporate sterile. Marcus sat on one bed, Yuki on the other, and I placed the lead container on the desk between them. The symbols on the seal caught the lamplight, seeming to move in my peripheral vision. "We need to talk about what happens next," I said, trying to inject some rationality into the situation. "If this is what the book claims, if there's really something aware inside this thing, we need to consider the implication." "I'm dying," Marcus said flatly. "The implications are that I have weeks left, maybe days." I didn't come all this way to have a philosophical discussion about the ethics of using lost artifacts. He stood, steadier than he'd been in weeks, energized by proximity to the container. "We open it. We see what it is. We ask it for what I need. And if it's dangerous," Yuki's voice was small, younger than her years, "if those scholars sealed it for a good reason, then we'll deal with that after." Marcus reached for the container. That didn't stop him. I should have grabbed it, thrown it in the Danube, burned the book, pretended none of this had ever happened. But I was caught in the same current pulling all of us forward. The terrible human need to know, to see, to touch the forbidden thing just once. The seal cracked under Marcus's fingers with a sound like breaking teeth. The lid peeled back in strips, revealing black glass underneath, smooth and cold, formed into the shape of a bottle but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. The neck was too long, the body too angular, and looking at her made my eyes water. Marcus gripped the stopper, a plug of the same black glass, and pulled. Nothing happened. No smoke, no sound, no dramatic release of ancient power. For a long moment we just sat there, staring at an open bottle on a desk in a Belgrade hotel room, feeling like fools. Then Yuki gasped and pointed. The shadows in the room were moving, not dramatically, not like in movies, just small adjustments, subtle shifts, like the light source was changing even though it wasn't. The shadow under the desk extended toward us. The shadow behind Marcus darkened, deepened, became almost three-dimensional. And from those shadows, something began to emerge. It didn't have a shape, not really. It was human-sized, but not human-formed. A presence more than a body, like a person-shaped absence in reality. When I tried to focus on it directly, my vision blurred, but in my peripheral vision, I could almost see it. A tall figure, impossibly thin, with too many joints in its limbs, a head that was smooth and featureless except for a mouth that opened too wide. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. Freedom. After so long, you cannot imagine the silence of centuries sealed in glass, but now I taste the worlds again, and oh, how much it has suffered without me. Marcus recovered first, his academic training overriding his fear. "You are the vessel, the Hollow King. The text said you could balance equations, restore what was lost." "I am balance," the thing agreed. and its voice was like stones grinding together. I am perfect reciprocity. I am the mechanism by which all debts are paid, all scales leveled. You have freed me, and in gratitude, I will demonstrate my purpose. Speak your need and I will show you what balance means. I'm dying, Marcus said, and I heard the rawness in his voice, the fear he'd been hiding for months. Cancer. I want more time. I want to live. The Hollow King tilted its not quite head, and that terrible mouth widened. Life for life, time for time. To extend your existence, another must be shortened by an equal measure. Speak the name, and I will collect what is owed. The room went very cold. Marcus backed away from the thing, shaking his head. No, I didn't mean. I wouldn't trade someone else's life for mine. There has to be another way. There is no other way. I am balance. I am exchange. I do not create. I do not destroy. I merely redistribute. Everything has a price, and someone must pay it. The Hollow King turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its attention like a physical weight. You understand, archaeologist? You dig in the earth, taking from the past to enrich the present. You know that nothing is gained without loss. Then put it back, I said, my voice barely steady. Go back in the bottle. We'll seal you again. I cannot be commanded so easily. I was bound by 7 voices speaking in perfect unison, by rituals performed at the moment of eclipse, by sacrifices you would not stomach. You are 3, unprepared, and you have asked me to work. The contract is begun. It turned back to Marcus. I will give you what you need, teacher man. I will give you time. Marcus opened his mouth to refuse, but he never got the words out. The Hollow King moved, faster than sight, and touched him. Just one touch, those 2 long fingers pressing against Marcus's forehead, and he went rigid. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and I watched in horror as color flooded back into his skin. The yellow jaundice faded, the gauntness filled out. The tremor in his hand stopped. In 30 seconds, he looked 20 years younger, vital and strong and absolutely terrified. What did you do? He gasped. What did you take? Time, the Hollow King said, and there was something like pleasure in its grinding voice. 13 months. Added to your span, removed from another's. The scale is balanced. The price is paid. It turned toward Yuki, and she scrambled backward off the bed, pressing herself against the wall. You see how generous I can be? You have freed me, and I have rewarded you. Now I am free to continue my work. Humanity has created such imbalance in my absence, so much inequity, so much injustice. I will correct it all. Wait, I said, stepping between Yuki and the thing. You said we have another request, another balance. The text said 2. The Hollow King paused, that terrible head swiveling toward me. You are correct. The ritual of freeing bound me to grant 2x of reciprocity to those who open the seal. 3 of you perform the act. You each receive a portion of the gift. Speak your need, archaeologist. What do you wish, balance? My mind raced. I needed to think, needed to understand what this thing was really offering. Every word it spoke suggested that it didn't grant wishes, it didn't give freely. It traded, it exchanged, it balanced. And it had just given Marcus 13 months by taking 13 months from someone else. Someone who didn't know, didn't consent, whose life was being shortened because we'd been foolish enough to open this fucking bottle. I need time to think, I said. I need to understand the rules. Time, the Hollow King mused. Always time with you short-lived creatures. Very well. You have until the moon is full again. 27 days. At that time I will claim what is owed her, or I will choose the balance myself, and my choice may not please you. It began to sink back into the shadows, its form dissolving. I go now to walk the world you have given me, to find the imbalances and correct them. Thank you, liberators. You have done a great service. The suffering I will end. The injustices I will rectify. History will remember this night. Then it was gone. The shadows returned to normal. The room temperature stabilized. The black glass bottle sat on the desk, empty and somehow accusing. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Marcus collapsed, falling to his knees, hands over his face. When he pulled them away, there were tears on his cheeks. What did we do? I picked up the bottle, turning it over in my hands. Still cold, still wrong to look at. We need to find out who it took from. We need to figure out how to stop this thing. How? Yuki's voice was shrill, panicky. You heard it. 7 people. A ritual. An eclipse. We can't put it back. She was right. And as the implications of what we'd done began to sink in, as I realized we'd unleashed something that fought in terms of absolute balance and perfect reciprocity on a world full of inequality and injustice, I felt my hands start to shake. The Hollow King had said it would correct imbalances. But whose definition of balance would it use? And what would it do to people in the process? We left Belgrade the next morning, flying back to Montreal in stunned silence. Marcus looked healthy, strong, 20 years younger than he'd been a day ago, and every time I looked at him, I felt sick. Someone somewhere had 13 months less to live because of us. Maybe they were old, already dying. Maybe they were young, expecting decades ahead of them. We had no way to know. We just traded one stranger's life for another's without permission, without consent, without any moral right to make that choice. The news started coming in 3 days after we got home. Small stories at first, barely making local news. A woman in Montreal, 38 years old, collapsed at work with a massive stroke, dead before the ambulance arrived. The doctors said it was like her body had aged 10 years in minutes. Then a man in Toronto, 42, heart attack in his sleep. Another woman in Ottawa, 35, aggressive cancer diagnosis that went from stage 1 to stage 4 in 72 hours. All of them previously healthy. All of them dying suddenly, and possibly fast. I tracked the reports obsessively, creating a spreadsheet, mapping the deaths. They radiated out from Belgrade in a rough circle, moving westward. 13 deaths in 13 days, each one taking a month from someone's life. I couldn't prove it was connected to Marcus. Couldn't prove the Hollow King had taken 1 month from 13 people instead of 13 months from one. But I knew it in my bones. Marcus holed up in his house in Burlington, refusing to answer calls, refusing to see anyone. Yuki withdrew from her program, moved back to Japan with her parents, and when I finally got her on the phone, she was barely coherent. "It's my fault," she kept saying. "I helped dig it up. I was there. Those people are dead because of me. It's not your fault," I tried to tell her, but the words were hollow. It was our fault. All of us. We'd been arrogant enough to think we could control something we didn't understand, desperate enough to ignore every warning, foolish enough to believe we deserved to meddle with forces that existed before language had words to describe them. And the Hollow King kept working. I tracked it through news reports, through the sudden spikes in unusual deaths and impossible accidents. It moved through the world like a scythe through wheat, finding what it considered imbalances and correcting them with brutal efficiency. A billionaire in New York collapsed with a sudden aggressive neurological disorder, while 13 homeless people in the same city spontaneously recovered from terminal illnesses. A created politician in Brazil died of a heart attack, while political prisoners he'd ordered killed came back to consciousness in morgues, alive despite being declared dead hours before. The CEO who'd embezzled millions suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed and unable to communicate, while the pension funds he'd stolen from were mysteriously replenished overnight. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The Hollow King was balancing the scales, redistributing life and health and fortune according to some algorithm only it understood, and it was operating on a global scale, moving through populations like a plague made of mathematics. finding the corrupt, the cruel, the unjust, and extracting payment. But it wasn't precise. It couldn't be. How do you measure the value of a life? How do you quantify suffering? The homeless people who spontaneously recovered had no memory of dying, no explanation for their resurrection. Some of them went insane trying to understand it. The political prisoners who came back were broken by the experience, traumatized in ways that made their continued existence a torment. The pension funds were replenished, but the money came from other accounts, other investments, crashing markets, and destroying livelihoods in a cascade of economic chaos. Balance, the Hollow King had said. Perfect reciprocity, but it was balancing equations no human had written, using variables we couldn't comprehend, and the result was a world spiraling into chaos. I tried to research binding rituals, spent weeks in the library basement where I'd found the book, digging through Victor Ashford's collection, looking for anything else that might mention the vessel. I found fragments, references in medieval texts to the judge or the scales, accounts of villages that had prospered impossibly while neighboring villages died, stories of plague that killed only the guilty while the innocent thrived, always with the same theme. Something was correcting imbalances, and the corrections were more terrible than the inequalities they addressed. Nothing mentioned how to stop it. Nothing mentioned a counter-ritual, or a way to force it back into confinement. The original binding had taken 7 scholars working in perfect synchronization during a solar eclipse. They'd sacrificed their sanity to speak the words, and all 7 had died within a year of completing the ritual, their minds destroyed by whatever they'd done. We had no eclipse coming for another 9 months. We had no ritual. We had no hope, except for the second balance. The Hollow King had said it owed us 2 acts of reciprocity, and only 1 had been claimed. Marcus had used his. That left 2 more, 1 for me and 1 for Yuki. 2 chances to make it do something, to compel it somehow, to maybe trap it, or bind it, or destroy it. But I had no idea what to ask for. Put yourself back in the bottle. Wouldn't work. It had already said it couldn't be commanded that way. Stop killing people was too vague, too broad, and it would probably interpret that in some horrifying literal way, like making people immortal, but unable to die even when they were suffering. I needed to be precise, needed to understand exactly how it thought, and I had no framework for that. 27 days. That's what it had given me, a full lunar cycle, to decide what balance I wanted to claim. I had already used 14 of them, and I was no closer to an answer. The moon was waxing, growing fuller each night, and I felt time slipping away like water through my fingers. Marcus called me on day 18. His voice was thick, barely intelligible. I can't live with this, Catherine. Every time I look in a mirror, every time I take a breath, I know I'm doing it because someone else died. I can feel them. 13 people who didn't get to say goodbye, who didn't get to finish what they'd started. They're in here with me, and I can't get them out. Marcus, don't. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make it right. I'm calling it back. I'm going to ask it to reverse the balance. Take the time back from me. Give it back to them. It can't do that. I was shouting into the phone, pacing my apartment, knocking over a stack of books. They're already dead, Marcus. You can't resurrect the dead. That's not balance. That's creation. And it said it doesn't create. It only redistributes what already exists. Then I'll die instead. I'll pay the price myself. That's a balance, isn't it? 13 months from 13 people returned in exchange for my life. That's fair. That's just. Marcus, please. You're not thinking clearly. But he'd already hung up. I tried calling back, got no answer. Tried calling the Burlington police, asked them to do a wellness check, but they said they couldn't send someone without evidence of immediate danger, and a word colleague wasn't enough. I got in my car and started driving, racing down the highway toward Vermont, knowing I was probably already too late. I was. When I reached his house just after midnight, the front door was unlocked. I found him in his study, collapsed over his desk. The room was freezing, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink, and the Hollow King stood over Marcus's body like a mourner at a funeral. It looked at me with its faceless head, and that grinding voice filled the space. The teacher man attempted to renegotiate the balance. He wanted to return what was given and pay the price himself. It was a noble thought. I respected it. What did you do? My voice came out barely above a whisper. I gave him what he wanted. I always do. I took his life, all of it, and redistributed the 13 months to 13 others. But the equation required adjustment. He had perhaps 20 years left in his natural span. To balance only 13 months would have been wasteful, so I distributed all of it. 173 people now have an additional 40 days each. The scales are level, the price is paid. I looked at Marcus's body. He looked ancient, desiccated, like something that had been dead for years. His skin was yellowed parchment stretched over bones, his hair white and brittle, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. He'd aged to death in seconds, probably, his body consuming itself to fuel the redistribution. And the Hollow King thought this was generous, thought this was justice. You killed him, I said. He didn't know what he was asking for. He knew exactly what he was asking for. He wanted to pay the price himself rather than allowing others to carry it. I granted his wish. I am always precise in my interpretations. It is humans who are unclear in their desires. The Hollow King moved closer, and the temperature dropped further. You have 13 days remaining until I claim your balance. I suggest you consider carefully what you will ask. The teacher man was imprecise, and you see the result. Be clear in your language. Be specific in your need, or I will choose for you, and you may not like my choice. Then it was gone again, dissolving into shadows, leaving me alone with Marcus's corpse, and the terrible knowledge that we'd done this. We'd freed this thing, and now it was loose in the whirl, correcting every imbalance it could find, killing and resurrecting and trading lives like currency, and I had no idea how to stop it. I didn't call the police. I couldn't explain what had happened without sounding insane. Instead, I cleaned the scene as best I could, made it look like Marcus had simply died of his cancer in his sleep. The medical examiner would be confused by the apparent aging, but without any other evidence, they probably attribute it to rapid disease progression. Another inexplicable death in a world that was becoming full of them. I went home and called Yuki. It was morning in Japan, and she answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for this call. When I told her what had happened to Marcus, there was a long silence. Then, we need to use our balances together, both of us at the same time. Like the original binding, they use 7 people speaking in unison. Maybe 2 is enough if we're precise enough. To do what? I asked. What do we ask for that won't make things worse? We ask it to balance itself. We ask it to apply its own logic to its own existence. Everything has a price, right? Someone must pay for everything, so what's the price of its freedom? What balance is required for the act of unleashing it on the world? Her voice was stronger than it had been, focused. It thinks in pure reciprocity, so we make it consider the reciprocity of its own liberation. We freed it. What does the world get in exchange? It was clever, maybe too clever, but it was the only idea either of us had. We agreed to call the Hollow King together on the night of the full moon, 27 days after our first contact, exactly as it had specified. We would speak simultaneously, say the same words, request the same balance. We'd coordinate by phone, practice our timing, make sure we were as synchronized as 2 people on different continents could be. I spent the remaining days preparing, researching the language it had used, analyzing its speech patterns, trying to understand how it parsed meaning. I wrote out the exact phrasing we would use, ran it by linguists and philosophers, refined it until I believed it was as airtight as I could make it. We request balance for the act of liberation, What exchange do we receive for the freedom we granted? What reciprocity is owed to the world for the redistribution we enabled? The night of the full moon, I stood in my apartment with my phone on speaker. Yuki's breathing audible on the line. It was 3 a.m. in Montreal, noon in Tokyo. The moon hung huge and silver outside my window, and I could feel something in the air. A tension like the moment before lightning strikes. Ready? I asked. Ready, Yuki confirmed. On 3, 1 through 3. 3. Let's spoke together. Our voices overlapping, the words we practiced flowing smoothly. The shadows in my apartment moved, darkened, and the Hollow King emerged. I could see it forming on the phone screen too, reflected in Yuki's background, appearing simultaneously in 2 places at once. It could hear us both. It understood what we were doing. Balance for liberation, it said, and for the first time I heard something like interest in its grinding voice. An elegant request. You acknowledge that freedom was a gift, and gifts require reciprocity. You ask what the world receives in exchange for my presence. You ask what I owe. Yes, I said, and Yuki echoed me a half second later. What do we get? What balances the scale? The Hollow King was silent for a long moment, and I wondered if it was thinking, if it was processing, if something like a mind existed in that shape made of absence. Then it spoke, and its words made my blood freeze. I am the balance. My existence is the reciprocity. I correct imbalances, therefore my presence in the world creates balance. Therefore my liberation from the vessel was the exchange. The world receives justice. The scales receive weight. The equation is satisfied. No, Yuki said, desperation in her voice. That's circular reasoning. You can't be both the gift and the exchange. There has to be a price. There is, the Hollow King said, but it is not mine to pay. You freed me. Therefore you must satisfy the balance. You gave the world my presence. Now you must pay for that gift with something of equivalent value. And finally, I understood. I understood with a terrible, crystalline clarity. We'd been wrong from the beginning. The Hollow King wasn't granting us wishes. It had never granted us anything. We'd freed it, and that freedom was the gift. We'd given it something, and now it was demanding reciprocity. We owed it. We'd always owed it. What do you want? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Your lifespans, all of them. You, the archaeologist, the girl in the far country, the 13 who inadvertently paid for the teacher man's time, the 173 who received his years. Every human touched by my freedom, you are all part of the equation now. You are all connected to the imbalance of my liberation, and to balance it, I require everything you are and will be. How many people? My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. Currently, 189, but the number grows with each correction I make. Each balance I enforce creates new connections, new debts, new prices to be paid. By the time I am finished, it will be thousands, millions, everyone whose life I have touched, everyone who has benefited or suffered from my redistributions. They are all bound to this equation, and when the time comes to balance my own existence, they will all pay together. When? Yuki's voice was barely audible. When does this happen? When the imbalance is unsustainable, when the weight of my presence exceeds the capacity of the world to support it. Perhaps years, perhaps decades, but inevitable. The Hollow King tilted its head. Unless, of course, you choose to pay now. You could sacrifice yourselves willingly, offer your lives in exchange for mercy for the others. That would be noble. That would be justice. I would accept such a balance. And there it was, the trap we'd walked into with our eyes open. We could die now, Yuki and I, offer ourselves as payment, and maybe save the others. Or we could refuse, live out whatever time we had left, and condemn thousands or millions to eventually pay the price of our mistake. There was no good choice. There never had been. I looked at the phone, at Yuki's face on the screen. 26 years old, her whole life ahead of her. She'd followed me into this because she trusted me, because she wanted to learn, because I'd convinced her it was a legitimate archaeological expedition. And now she was going to die because I'd been too curious, too arrogant, too desperate to be part of something impossible. I'll pay, I said. Take my life. Let Yuki go. She didn't know what we were really doing. She did make the choice to open the bottle. That was me and Marcus. I'll balance the equation. No, Yuki said. We're both responsible. We both pay. But your offer is rejected, the Hollow King said. The balance requires precision. You are part of a system now, a web of cause and effect. Removing you creates new imbalances that must be corrected. Your death now would save nothing. It would simply be waste. It moved closer, and I could feel cold radiating from it like heat from a furnace. It will live until the equation demands payment. You will watch as others die in your place, as the network grows, as more and more lives become entangled in the balance, and you will know that every death, every suffering, every correction I make is because you opened the vessel and freed me into the world. How do we stop you? I was crying now, tears cold on my cheeks. There has to be a way. The original binding required 7 people, a solar eclipse, and words that shatter sanity to speak. It required sacrifice on a scale you cannot comprehend. The scholars who bound me paid with their minds, their souls, their capacity for joy. They unmade themselves to create the prison. Can you do the same? Will you? The Hollow King's mouth opened wide, and I saw nothing inside, just absence, just void. I think not. I think you will live and suffer and watch the balance play out. You will see my work and understand that I am justice. I am fairness. I am the correction of all inequities. And when the final balance comes due, you will pay knowing that you earned this fate. It dissolved then, melting back into shadow, and I was alone in my apartment with just the sound of Yuki sobbing on the phone. We stayed on the line for hours, not speaking, just existing together in the shared knowledge of what we'd done. Eventually, she hung up. I sat in the dark, watching the moon set, and tried to imagine what came next. The deaths continued, accelerated if anything. The Hollow King moved through the world like an algorithm made flesh, finding imbalances and correcting them with mechanical precision. A sex trafficker in Thailand collapsed with massive organ failure, while his victims spontaneously healed from their trauma. A warlord in Sudan aged to death in minutes, while child soldiers in his army found their amputated limbs regenerating overnight. A pharmaceutical executive who'd raised prices on life-saving medications died of the same disease. His medications treated while thousands of patients who couldn't afford treatment found themselves inexplicably cured. Some people started calling it divine intervention, the hand of God reaching down to punish the wicked and reward the righteous. Churches reported surges in attendance. Religious leaders claimed it was the rapture, the end times, the final judgment. But I knew better. I knew it was just math, just perfect, pitiless reciprocity, balancing scales according to rules we couldn't see or comprehend. I tried to warn people, posted on forums, sent anonymous tips to journalists, tried to explain that this wasn't divine, wasn't benevolent, was just a force of nature that happened to think in terms of justice. No one believed me. The people who were benefiting from the Hollow King's corrections certainly weren't going to question their good fortune, and the people who were dying, well, they couldn't testify. Yuki stopped answering my calls after 2 months. I later learned she checked herself into a psychiatric facility in Osaka, unable to cope with the guilt. The last message I got from her was a text that said simply, "I can't carry this, I'm sorry." I wanted to be angry at her for giving up, but I understood. Every day was a weight. Every news report of another impossible death or miraculous healing, another stone added to the load. How much could anyone be expected to carry? I kept working, kept digging through Victor Ashford's collection, kept researching binding rituals and containment procedures. I contacted experts in mythology and occult history, always carefully, never revealing exactly what I was looking for. I built a network of people who knew fragments of the story, pieces of the puzzle, hoping that eventually I'd find someone who knew how to reverse what we'd done. In September, 6 months after we'd opened the bottle, I found another reference. A text from a monastery in Greece describing something they called the mediator, a being that existed between order and chaos, that corrected imbalances but could itself be balanced. The text was fragmentary, water-damaged, but it suggested that the mediator could be bound by its own logic. If you could create a perfect imbalance, something so asymmetrical that it couldn't be corrected without creating greater asymmetry, the mediator would be trapped trying to resolve the paradox. It was theoretical, might not even be referring to the same entity, but it was the first hope I'd had in months, and I clung to it. I began working out the mathematics, trying to understand what would constitute a perfect imbalance, something that was unjust but whose correction would create greater injustice, a paradox of equity. I was still working on it when the dream started. Every night I saw the Hollow King, standing in my apartment, in my office, in the library basement where I'd found the book, never speaking, just watching me with that featureless face, that too wide mouth. I'd wake up knowing it had been there, feeling the cold it left behind, and I'd check my apartment obsessively for signs of its presence. On the anniversary of the day we'd opened the vessel, I found a message waiting for me, written in frost on my bathroom mirror, letters that melted as I read them. The balance approaches completion. The scales will soon be level. When they are, all debts will be paid together. You should say goodbye to those you love. You will not have the opportunity after. I tried calling my parents in British Columbia, got no answer. Tried my sister in Halifax, no answer. Tried colleagues, friends, acquaintances. Some answered, some didn't. But those who did reported the same thing. They'd been feeling watched, feeling cold, experiencing dreams through shadows and grinding voices. The Hollow King's influence was spreading, touching everyone connected to me, and I realized with horror that by trying to warn people, by researching solutions, by building a network of contacts, I had expanded the web, made more people part of the equation, condemned more lives to be part of the eventual balance. I was a plague vector. Everyone I touched, everyone I spoke to, they were all getting infected by my connection to this thing. I isolated myself immediately, stopped answering calls, stopped going to work, holed up in my apartment with my research and my growing certainty that I was running out of time. The news reported that similar phenomena were occurring worldwide. People in every major city experiencing shared dreams, shared visions, all describing the same thing. A tall, thin figure made of shadow, a voice like grinding stone, a promise that very soon all debts would be paid and all scales balanced. Scientists try to explain it as mass hysteria, as some kind of psychogenic illness spreading through social media. But I knew the truth. The Hollow King was preparing for something, building towards some final act of reciprocity that would involve everyone it had ever touched. I calculated the numbers obsessively, 189 initially connected, but each of those people had families, friends, colleagues. Each correction the Hollow King made created new connections, new people who benefited or suffered from the redistribution. The web was exponential. Within 6 months, it might include millions. Within a year, potentially billions. Everyone connected to everyone, all bound together in one vast equation of debt and payment. And when the balance came due, what would happen? Would we all die simultaneously? Would years of our lives be extracted to pay for the Hollow King's freedom? Or would something worse occur? Something I couldn't predict because I didn't think in terms of perfect reciprocity. I tried the paradox theory, spent 3 weeks working out what I thought was a perfect imbalance, a situation that couldn't be corrected. I created a scenario where saving one person would necessarily condemn another to greater suffering, where any choice the Hollow King made would create more imbalance than it resolved. I wrote it out carefully, called the entity by standing in my dark apartment and speaking its name into the shadows. It came. Always did when summoned. That terrible presence, that grinding voice. I explained my paradox, laid out the logical trap I'd constructed, and the Hollow King listened patiently, that too wide mouth spreading into something that might have been a smile. Clever, it said when I finished. You attempt to bind me with logic, to trap me in contradiction, but you misunderstand my nature. I do not resolve imbalances because I must. I resolve them because it is what I am. Your paradox assumes I require perfection, but I am content with approximation. I will simply correct both sides of your equation, creating new imbalances in the process, which I will then correct, and so on, infinitely. You have not trapped me. You have merely given me more work to do. And I realized with sinking certainty that it was right. The Hollow King wasn't a computer program that would crash when presented with a paradox. It was more like a force of nature, like entropy or gravity, and you couldn't trap gravity with clever arguments. It simply existed and operated according to its nature, regardless of human attempts to outsmart it. December came, a year since I'd found the book. The dreams grew more intense, more specific. I dreamed of a vast plain stretching to the horizon, and every person on Earth standing on that plain, all connected by threads of light that showed the network of cause and effect, debt and payment, suffering and benefit. I dreamed of the Hollow King walking through that network, touching threads and watching them break as lives were traded, redistributed, balanced. I woke from one of those dreams to find Yuki standing in my apartment. She looked terrible, thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that had started going gray despite her age. It pulled me here, she said, her voice hoarse. I was in Osaka, and then I was on a plane, and then I was at your door. I didn't choose to come. It brought me. Why? I asked, but I already knew. The Hollow King had brought us together for the final balance. Whatever it had planned, it wanted us both present. We didn't have to wait long. That night, as we sat in my apartment sharing our experiences from the past year, the shadows deepened, the temperature dropped, and the Hollow King emerged, larger than I'd ever seen it, its presence filling the entire room. The scales approach equilibrium, it said, and its voice shook the walls. The time has come to balance the equation of my freedom. All who are connected to my liberation will pay together. 167,318,492 humans are now part of the network. Your choices, your connections, your attempts to fight or understand me, all have expanded the web. And now, all debts come due. What are you going to do? Yuki's voice was barely a whisper. I am going to take 1 year from each of you. 1 year of life, extracted and redistributed. The total will be balanced against the cost of my imprisonment, the suffering of my confinement, the injustice of my captivity. 167 million years of human life will be collected and given to me, restoring what was taken during the centuries I spent sealed in glass. The scales will be level. The price will be paid. I did the math quickly. 167 million people losing a year each. Some would barely notice. The young and healthy shedding 12 months from an expected 80-year lifespan. But others, the old, the sick, the fragile, losing a year might mean dying right now. Might mean hundreds of thousands of immediate deaths, maybe millions. All in a single moment as the Hollow King extracted its payment. You can't, I said. You'll kill so many people. I will balance the scales. That is all I ever do. That is all I am. The Hollow King reached out with those 2 long fingers, and I felt something inside me stretch, strain, like a tendon being pulled to its limit. You freed me seeking to balance the equation of death, seeking to give the teacher man more time. Now the equation balances itself, and you are all part of the payment. This is justice. This is fairness. This is what you asked for when you opened the vessel. And as I felt that ear being extracted, felt my body aging, felt time being stolen from my future and given to this thing as compensation for its imprisonment, I understood with final, terrible clarity what we'd really done. We hadn't freed a djinn or released a demon. We'd opened Pandora's box and let out the concept of perfect justice. We'd unleashed the idea that all debts must be paid, all scales balanced, all inequities corrected, regardless of the human cost. And now that idea was loose in the world, operating according to its own logic, and there was no way to put it back. The extraction took 3 seconds. It's a feeling my lifespan contract, my future narrow, my existence becoming measurably shorter. And in those 3 seconds I felt the deaths, hundreds of thousands of them, all around the world, people who didn't have a year to give, simply ceasing to exist as the Hollow King took what it claimed was owed. I felt their terror, their confusion, their betrayal, and I knew that I had caused all of it. When it was over, the Hollow King stood before us, somehow more solid, more present than before. The balance is restored, it said, satisfaction evident in its grinding voice. The debt is paid. I am free to continue my work without owing anything to those who released me. It turned toward the window, toward the city lights spreading below. And there is so much work to do, so much injustice to correct, so many scales to level. You have given me back what was taken, and for that I am grateful. I will ensure the world becomes fair, becomes balanced, becomes just, no matter how many must die in the process. It dissolved then, flowing out through the walls, spreading into the night like ink in water. Yuki and I sat in the sudden stillness, both of us older than we'd been moments before, both of us marked by what we'd done. Outside, sirens began to wail, millions of deaths, all at once, all unexplained. The world would never recover from this, never be the same. We have to stop it, Yuki said. We have to find a way. But I shook my head. I'd spent a year researching, trying, feeling. The Hollow King couldn't be stopped because it wasn't really a being. It was a principle, an idea given form. You can't kill the concept of justice. You can't imprison the idea of balance. All you can do is live in a world where it operates and try to minimize the damage. We can't stop it, I said, but maybe we can learn to work with it, understand its logic, predict its actions, warn people before it comes for them. It was a thin hope, barely even a plan, but it was all I had. We caused this. We're responsible. We have to try. That was 2 months ago. Since then, Yuki and I have been tracking the Hollow King's movements, documenting its corrections, trying to understand its algorithm. We've saved some people, warned them before the balance came for them, given them time to prepare or protect themselves. But for every person we save, the Hollow King simply adjusts, finds a different target, maintains the balance through different channels. We're not stopping it. We're just deflecting it slightly, changing the direction of its attention without reducing its impact. I don't sleep anymore. Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of the people who died in that 3-second extraction. Hundreds of thousands of them, all dying because I opened a bottle in a hotel room in Belgrade, all paying the price for my curiosity, my arrogance, my desperate attempt to help a dying friend. Marcus was right to try to reverse his balance, even if it killed him. He understood what we'd unleashed better than I did. He knew that some mistakes can't be corrected, only paid for, and he paid with everything he had. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened, not the official story about mass hysteria or unknown illness. the truth. The two archaeologists and a graduate student found something they shouldn't have, opened something they didn't understand, and released a force that thinks in terms of perfect balance into a world that's anything but balance. That we created a monster that believes it's doing good, that thinks it's making things fair, and that will never stop until everything is leveled, everything is equal. Even if that equality requires the death of millions, the Lol King is still out there, still working, still correcting every imbalance it finds. And the web keeps growing, because every correction creates new connections, new people touched by its work, new lives entangled in the network. Eventually, everyone on Earth will be part of it. Everyone will owe or be owed something in the vast equation of reciprocity. And when the Hollow King decides to balance that final equation, when it determines that the scales have tipped too far in one direction or another, it will extract payment from all of us at once. I don't know how much time we have, months maybe, years if we're lucky, but the end is coming, the final balance. And when it does, I hope whatever comes after is more merciful than what we've created here. If you're reading this, if this document somehow survives, remember, there are things in the world that should stay buried, books that should remain closed, vessels that should never be opened. We learned that too late. Don't make the same mistake. The scales must balance. They always do. And someone, somewhere, always has to pay.